All right, welcome to the Ask Us Anything session on Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and as well as Nietzsche's philosophy. I'm here with, just a sec. I'm just here with two guys who I've been involved with the Nietzsche Dialogues, or who have been involved in the Nietzsche Dialogues, which was a series I've been doing over the last month and a half. Thomas Winn, who I discussed overcoming nihilism with, and Layman Pascal, who I discussed we called it Pascal's Nietzsche, and we went through Layman's sort of understanding of Nietzsche and the relation, I suppose, between Nietzsche and Layman's worldview. So yeah, great to have you guys both back on, and thanks for joining me. I guess, like, to set it up before we have any questions, this is a Ask Us Anything, so please feel free to leave any comments. And we'll be here, I suppose. Well, at least I'll be here for as long as there are questions to answer. And just to remind everyone watching that this is in sort of a promo and support for the upcoming Thus Spoke Zarathustra course, which the first official class will be on July 17th, and we'll be running for 9 weeks. There'll be 6 classes. And there are also 3 tiers in which you can work on the recorded level, the live level, or one-on-one with me. So if you're interested in that, see philosophyportal.online. And yeah, welcome back, Thomas and Layman. Great to have you here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you too, man. Good to see both of you.
Good to see both of you. And it's nice to be here with Layman as well, because technically we haven't spoken yet. So hopefully this
will be our first chance to grow together a little bit.
To spiritualize everything, yeah.
Right.
No, it's a pleasure. That's the best word to use. I think I used it last time. Pleasure.
Yeah. So I think before we have any questions, I would just ask you guys about maybe your experience with the Nietzsche Dialogue series. Maybe Thomas, I'll ask you first a question, as sort of your first time in a podcast circuit and coming from academia. How do you feel about the experience, and how do you think about maybe the relationship? Because I know you're deep in academia right now. What's the relationship in your mind before this type of activity and what you're doing in academia?
Yeah, I think the person who introduced me to your YouTube channel, he's doing his undergraduate degree. And so he's researching philosophy, different ideas, Freud, Lacan, and he came across your channel and he sent it to me. And it was nice because in the space that you've made, you're conversing. So it's not just a video stream where you're kind of proposing a different idea. What I enjoyed most was when I watched I mentioned it last time, the philosophy of lack, because you have 4 people conversing about their interpretations of what lack is for them personally, and then through what they've experienced through their reading, through their watching, through their observing, through their being. And for me, this is what can be hard to find in academia, because it's always presented with a certain intentionality, within a certain framework, which requires funding, which requires, direction. There's people to please. But I think these open spaces are literally open to say what you want, what you need to say, what you feel like how you want to participate. So in terms of the conversation we had, which again, in ways, it was I think your questioning was provoking me to think in ways which became very subjective in my experience of them. But I think that enabled me to talk about it in a very general but very nice way, even for myself. So after, I felt very kind of this relates to life, not just always about the abstractions and whether something kind of makes sense within its tradition. Instead, it's well, no, this is my opinion and I can see an overlap. And I think what you've done with your work, and this is maybe the advertisement for your course, you're providing that space for people just to engage, directly.
Right.
It was a pure pleasure, really a pure pleasure.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I agree. The open-ended, circulating intersubjectivity of it was really good. I think that's missing in a lot of rigorous thought spaces, and definitely Nietzsche is a good, and particularly Zarathustra is a really good locus for bringing something forward that's still full of a lot of untapped energy and ideas that could be useful going forward as civilization. But in order to tap into that, we've got to be circulating. We've got to be fresh. We can't just be publishing a book or going to a course. It's got to be really open in order to find the chutes and the crevices and the places where this thing could be regenerated into something useful going forward.
Yeah. On that note, like how and I'm in my sort of perception of both of you. In some sense, I get like sort of the opposite ends of this spectrum of Nietzsche, because we got Thomas, you're deep into the academic side of things, and Layman, you're kind of, I don't know how I don't know how it's best to describe you, but I think I've said before, you're kind of like, you have the knowledge of a university professor, but you're kind of different stylistically, and you're kind of outside of academia stylistically as well. So like, how do we put these two things together is something that's always in my mind, because I'm also kind of trained within an academic background, but I'm also very much outside of an academic background now. And it's kind of hard to know how to best put these two ends in dialogue with each other.
I think we can look at Nietzsche's look at Nietzsche's critique of the university in a way, like the systems that provide this drying out of thinking. So he himself, when he retired, was able to have this space and engage with people around him in a very clear way, you know? And I think so his critique is like a critique of the system that kind of we try to go into if you go into academia in a way. But then I would also say there is space within academia where you find professors who are open-minded, that do play within the system a bit and can introduce a type of thinking around Nietzsche, which kind of relates it back to life affirmation. So there are some people that I know who are quite inspiring within the framework, within the institution. But then I think what I saw from your talk, Layman, like when you're thinking, I can tell you're thinking, you're engaging with, like, not for the purpose of doing something, but just for the fact that it's your being, it's your spirit, your place where you are. So like, yeah, that's a big question. How do you introduce that into the framework of a university? Maybe you can't, but maybe you can just try to play the system in some ways, you know?
And one way to do it is to think of it as being some kind of dialectical relationship where, you know, like Badiou thinks about philosophers and anti-philosophers. Bruce Alderman, when I was going to meet John Vervaeke, he joked that because he was a professor and I'm an anti-professor, that the meeting might cause some kind of antimatter explosion that we should watch out for. So the idea that the institutional form of knowledge might need to be challenged and balanced out by an alternative so that they get something better, I think that's one approach. The other approach is that the institutions are in the process of being replaced by something more organic, more mycelial, more network oriented. And that doesn't mean there's no use to them at the moment. They're still really powerful. They could have a role going forward, but we are seeing a lot of the interesting ideas and energy happening in a more free range fashion now, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think building off that, we have our first question coming in from Max Mackin. So I'll just say the question and then maybe expand on it a little bit. Max asks, do you guys think there is a correct interpretation of Nietzsche? What does it mean for an interpretation of Nietzsche to be correct or good? And I would just want to link this to like some of the work I was doing in preparation for this course was like a field analysis of post-Nietzschean interpretation and just all the range of different interpretations. And I think it is interesting to think specifically, maybe not so much if there's a correct interpretation, but what does it mean to have a good interpretation? Or, you know, how can we distinguish between a good and a bad interpretation? In this case, specifically of Nietzsche, since there have been so many people to try and interpret his work. Do you guys, either you guys have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think it brings out the big question of like, what is the truth of a text, of an idea? What we said about nihilism. Can you understand a framework of somebody's thinking and represent that type of thinking, represent the essential ideas? As I find like quite provocative in Heidegger, he says like we need to follow the essential thinking of the person who has written the text, you know? Like he would say behind the thinking there is the essential path of thought. So when, like, for example, his book, The Question Concerning the Thing, which concerns Kant's place within Western history, he's guiding us through what he calls the essential thinking of Kant. So when you read this, it's like, well, yeah, maybe there is a type of thinking where we can read Nietzsche's direction, where he himself, I think even the thing you had today with Alexander Bard, where you're talking about guiding yourself through Nietzsche's own progression around Zarathustra and how important that is to understand. So the idea is like, but then again, like in the conversation we had, I'm also interested in the postmodern aspect, which always centers on the of how important interpretation is. So there are no facts. So when you go to interpret Nietzsche, we're coming from our own perspective, and that perspective is like projecting onto Nietzsche our own biases, culture, language, you know. But then when I read Heidegger, it's nice to think that you can follow Nietzsche's essential thinking. And I would say in doing so, like, you can find these moments in his thinking where he just makes sense beyond just what I said before about maxims and aphorisms. Like, I think it's good to be skeptical, you know. And again, it depends on your perspective of history, of truth. Can you get to the essential idea that somebody's trying to put forward, or are you always persuaded by your own subjective position? And I think that's why it's nice to talk about good instead of true, because in a way you can be pragmatic and say, well, from following this interpretation of Nietzsche's ideas, you're thinking something about him which maybe he didn't even think in today's context. So maybe they're like, it's beyond wrong or right, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not so much correct as much as good potentially. Just in context of like the post-Nietzschean field analysis, I know Bard said, for example, that Max Moore's transhumanist interpretation of Nietzsche and Ayn Rand's objectivist interpretation of Nietzsche were both just nonsense. Like that I should just get them off the list. Like, so like, I guess in his view, like there are like bad interpretations we shouldn't even consider. Layman, do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think there are some underlying repeating structures, you know, in that Heideggerian sense of trying to think what Nietzsche is thinking, but those are so amenable to interpretation that we would have to say there's no correct interpretation. Especially, I would say the people worth engaging with are the people who are complex enough that they keep stimulating you to grow and change and see new things. So if you could arrive at a correct interpretation of a philosopher, that philosopher would not be worth your study. I would say a good interpretation of Nietzsche is one that you're capable of falling in love with. One, you know, it's an interpretation where you start to see an individual, idiosyncratic, positive understanding of his terms in a way that is not foreclosed, right? It's not dismissive. You know, go, oh, I got Nietzsche and that's what he was saying and that's why I don't have to worry about it. It's a version, it's a way of piecing together the ideas in a way that's meaningful and true as far as you're concerned and keeps your own development open. That's a good interpretation.
Very well said, yeah.
I like this well, both ideas that a correct interpretation would kill the philosopher. You kind of like that reminds me of what you were saying, Thomas, about Heideggerian philosophy, where they're emphasizing this inexhaustibility of interpretation. Am I losing? Am I coming through audio wise?
Yeah.
I think
I can hear you.
Take over. I think my audio's messed.
Okay. Yeah, just to point on that aspect, like, yeah, some post-Heideggerian thinkers keep reiterating this word of inexhaustibility, because even if interpretation is subjective, the inexhaustibility of the fact that so because there is a failure in interpretation, because we are subjective in the way that we understand a text, an idea, and how that idea structures the bigger ideas. Even if it is subjective, that creates a space where then you can affirm your own being. So what you said, Layman, about using Nietzsche's essential thinking to reshift your mindset, to radicalize your own perspective. Instead of just reading a book and saying, okay, I've read Nietzsche's idea of this. I think Nietzsche's whole intentionality, the reason why he does what he did, was to provoke us to question the framework in which we live, you know, to see whether there can be a productivity. And I think this is where inexhaustibility comes in, because an interpretation can or cannot open you up to a kind of openness, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's true of all rich thinkers, but it's especially true of Nietzsche, because he makes such a point of being non-systematic in his presentation and of moving through multiple perspectives in order to sample reality in different ways. So there's no he goes down these little pockets to see what he can mine there. He's not trying to say that any one of those pockets is his whole system. So if you think you've got a complete representation, you're almost being antithetical to the way that he thinks about thought itself.
Exactly, yeah. And that's his whole critique of truth. Like, truth is the biggest illusion because it sets you on a path of thinking where you're hoping to attain something at the end, a conclusion, a system. Whereas Nietzsche's more like, I think Nietzsche is a kind of artist in that sense. Like, look at the Birth Tragedy. He called himself like, he said what he's doing is providing an artist's metaphysics in a way, not to provide a system, but to provide the constant pushing, the constant upheaval of systems, which then goes back to your point, Layman, because that's where maybe the truth of a text comes out, meaning in how you relate to it, how you experience it, and for what purpose, So maybe nihilism is to show us that there is no purpose, but that is the purpose.
Yeah. And I think there's, it's easy to extend that into a totally relativistic model, but I think there are, for certain niches, right, for a type of person, for the type of discussion we're having, for this historical moment, for the technological and informational background of the society we're emerging into, there may be a privileged set of interpretations that we mutually vet through discussion. And that goes to Bard's point of there might be some we say that's really not a useful one for who we are and what we're doing and what the moment of the world is.
Yeah, exactly. And this is so I mentioned it before in my talk. There's a type of philosophy called hermeneutics, which would center itself on that exact point, to say, like, how is it being read today? What's its effectivity? Like, how is it affecting things? So then it's not even a question of right or wrong. It's just looking at the engagement that we have and other people have with a text, a person, an idea, especially around Nietzsche. His idea again is like to what I said before, annihilate ideas, to open the playing field. And from what you've said before, like with your interest in like spirituality, I think that's the juncture, that the spatial time from which we begin to be agnostic, to be questioning in that field of like, okay, now I realize that my idea of what I'm trying to name, I can't do so because of my subjective interpretation. But then that opens up the whole field to inexhaustibility, to and that's why Nietzsche is so powerful. I think in my talk I related that to my passage through Christianity, how Nietzsche was somebody within the Western philosophical tradition who like pushed me that bit further in understanding my ideas towards things. So him and my interpretation becomes its effect,
I'm back, guys.
Back.
Sorry about that. I hope
that's okay. We got this.
Yeah, you got this. I know you guys.
Yeah,
okay. What did I miss?
Not much, just an interpretation. It's raw. So we're still
on interpretation. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to go through. There's Through Human Eyes asked. He said, "Hey, the homies. Wanted to ask what percentage of Nietzsche's conclusions do you feel are what Nietzsche wanted subjectively for himself versus what he objectively thought all people should want if they knew what they needed?" Big ups, much love from Through Human Eyes. You want to handle that, Layman?
Yeah, that's an interesting dichotomy, and what I immediately think of is an intermediary category, right? That Nietzsche was writing for a subset of the population that may or may not have existed at the time when he was writing. So there obviously is some of what he's talking about that is for himself and what he hopes, right? None of us can avoid that part of it. And there's obviously some of it which is general in character in the way he thinks about human beings, human psychology, human societies. But the bulk of it is in some intermediary zone where what he wants to do is, I think, suggest ways of approaching the world that could be of use to an emerging class of new kinds of philosophers and daring spirits and people who might be able to really take nihilism seriously and cross to the other side. I think he views sort of the ethics of his writing as providing handbooks for those people in particular. So I would say it's 80% that, and then like 10% himself and 10% everybody.
Thomas, what
completely
do you?
agree.
Yeah. Okay. You want to
I
explain?
think
Do you
especially it's
think?
interesting about the 10% himself, because you see this in some of his writings where these moments of like poetry in his work, he's talking again about himself experiencing oneness, nihilism, the nothingness, the abyss. And it becomes poetry, I think, in these moments, because he's not writing for everybody. He's writing for no one, like it explodes in these moments. And I think this is my opinion of when Nietzsche is at his best. And I think we all are as human beings when we're not doing something for somebody else. We're just like splurging. And this is maybe when he becomes a bit like harder to grasp, but then in the context of his work, these moments are so rich in his work,
Yeah.
He becomes the mystic.
Mm-hmm.
He becomes, yeah.
Yeah,
So
his
then question maybe
presentation of
objectively,
himself progressively transcends himself. Like it becomes Nietzsche, the character in the Ecce Homo, but also in the letters. Like one of my favorite letters is it's very sly. He says, "Look, I would prefer to have been a Basel professor than God, but I can't refrain from creating the universe because of my own egotism." Right? And you're like, what an incredible joke for a mystic who's having divine experiences to make, to phrase it that way. But at the same time, he's doing this thing he does in all of his later books, which is make like a reality TV character out of himself. So he's not talking about himself when he is talking about himself, but that's how he talks about himself. It creates this beautiful resonance toward the end. Earlier on, I think you get a lot more of him as just a human character trying to struggle with thoughts.
The mediator maybe in the earlier work. I think this just reminded me of how like from what I understand of his later work, it's like the play. It's a playing with masks. So this Gianni Vattimo, who's part of my research, he wrote a book, The Subject and Its Mask. And he emphasizes this part of Nietzsche's work, not so much Nietzsche's own, like what you said, like this like moment of egotism where it like plays, but it's how his work in certain moments is like wearing a mask, which reminds us that at all times we're wearing masks. So when he has this egotism, it sounds like he's stepping away from how things should be or how society is, but in a way he's playing by them making us reflect on what we think we are. And I think that's why he's a constant provocateur, which makes us, which brings us to that awareness of, okay, I'm also wearing a mask and I can also play with that mask. I can also enjoy my mystical experience by playing with the idea that I am God. And see where that leads you.
Yeah, I like that because it's like this redoubling of appearance. Like oftentimes we have this, I think, simplistic distinction between the appearance and the truth. And it's kind of like this redoubling of appearance puts the truth in the appearance, and then you play with the mask. It's not just the truth is taking away the masks. So something like that. There's another question by Max who says, in relation to Bard on Max Moore, what if Moore is not interpreting Nietzsche but appropriating Nietzsche? Foucault took the creative element from Nietzsche but rejected Nietzsche's anti-egalitarianism. So he's asking basically, is Max Moore appropriating Nietzsche for his own ends? Let's say like the transhuman ends. I think from my perspective, it would be hard to make the case that Nietzsche himself would be a transhuman in the sense of Max Moore's technological mediation of the human. But at the same time, I can also sort of get why Max Moore would see a lot of the heroic self-overcoming in transhumanism and in line with transhumanism. So in that sense, like I do see personally Max Moore's reappropriation of Nietzsche in that context as at least opening an interesting conversation.
I don't know anything about Max Moore, so
I know more a little bit, and I think there's a set of Nietzsche readers who are interested in one or two particular aspects of him, rather than in trying to get a more comprehensive picture of what he's thinking. I think Moore falls into that category. It's not clear that Nietzsche is thinking anything like technological transhumanism, although it's a very natural place to go in the contemporary environment. I think what Nietzsche is thinking is that something that feels uncanny and inhuman is a necessary thing for us to wrestle with and absorb in order to take our humanity to the next level. And if that's phrased as technological, okay. But I think that's only one way of picking up on one or two variables in Nietzsche. So I don't think of him as a Nietzsche, as an interpreter or presenter of Nietzsche. He's just grabbing some ideas that are evocative for him and using it with his thoughts. So closer to appropriation, but there's nothing wrong with appropriation.
It goes back to what we said before,
Yeah, with the ends, yeah.
The effect of certain thoughts. Yeah.
Right. So Max Mackin has another question who says, well, this one's directed at me, but I think I can open it up to both of you because I think both of you, I think will have some perspective on this. Max says, Cadell, what do you think is the essential relation and overlap with Hegel and Nietzsche? But the first thing I want to say is that I will be sort of giving in the course itself, in the opening of the course itself, I'm going to be doing an introduction where I give my specific connection and sort of how I see phenomenology of spirit and thus spoke Zarathustra as connecting with each other. So I'll save a bit of that for the course. But I know, Thomas, you've played a little bit with this idea of putting Hegel and Nietzsche into connection. And I know, Layman, you've also expressed sort of an explicit interest in this idea. So what do you guys think about this?
Yeah, Layman, you can go first if you wish.
There's lots of different angles where you can make plausible correlations between the two. And it's interesting to do that, like I was saying, about the way Bard brings Hegel in here, because people normally postulate Nietzsche and Hegel as kind of antitheses.
Yeah.
And you could say that's the necessary dialectical partner for Hegel in order for Hegel's thought to be completed.
Mm-hmm.
I think a really interesting set of connections is the shared willingness to embrace what seems like the negative or the absent dimension of experience. And I think it's worth looking at the transvaluation of values as a dialectical move, as us being unable to think our values until we've attempted to lower their value or test them or devalue them in some way in order to get to what the actual promise of those values are.
Yeah, I would agree that that's the essential move in a way. It's the, what does Zizek say? It's like tarrying with the negative. I think both, like Nietzsche explicitly tarries with nihilism, and Hegel explicitly tarries with negativity. And I think both do so to different degrees in a way. And I think we can, like you said, complete Hegel's system through Nietzsche. But I think Nietzsche can also be completed by contemporary readings of Hegel, which I think you both had a conversation, I think, on self-relating negativity or the negation of the negation. This came up in our conversation on overcoming nihilism. There's a certain type of negativity that I think both explicitly play with, which not just devalues the values, but it actually takes away or at least critiques the ground from which we need those values. So it's not just like from one position to the next. It's a whole exposition of the very framework which gave us those options in the first place, I think, like, again, Zizek repeats it by saying all choices that we have within a certain framework, like political choices, social choices, are always framed by the choices that we're given from before. And that's a type of more radical negativity. It's not just saying, okay, not number one, I'll take number two, we can exclude number three. This type of negativity that I think Hegel and Nietzsche play with is to say, well, why are we thinking in that framework in the first place? So I think the way in this nihilism works, this negativity, it really takes away the ground from which even nihilism is a problem in the first place, And I think this is why in Hegel, he can read the death of God through Christ as a type of affirmation of the spirit, because it's not just like, okay, it's either God or nothingness, or Christ or nothingness. For him, Christ's death was the symbol in which it's not just like, okay, now nothingness. It's the destruction of the very framework in which we think that they're the only options, And I think Nietzsche does this with how, again, I tried to speak through this. I don't think I did an amazing job of what he means when he talks about the eternal within the eternal reoccurrence of the same. There's something about negativity which relates to becoming, where we see where the whole framework in which we are existing is itself also ready to be defolded, ungrounded, you know? And I think this is the essential aspect for me, which goes to your point, Layman, you know, negativity.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche, and this is to some degree true of people like Kierkegaard as well. They're extending what's implied by Hegel. You know, there's a sense in which Hegel is presenting this vision, but he's still doing it from the mode of the classical philosopher. It's sort of this fixed, grand picture, this totalizing image. But what's implied by that thing is absolutely the opposite of the classical position of the philosopher. So that Nietzsche takes that, the necessary and implied next step further and makes it much more vital, much more bodily, much more uncontrolled and transformative than Hegel was willing to articulate it as. Even though it's there.
I think as it regards to like your point about Hegel presenting the picture of a classical philosopher, but actually sort of doing the opposite. I think what's often missed and what's stated explicitly in the phenomenology is that totalizing picture is meant to be worked through and then discarded. And I think it's that moment of discarding, you know, like this big picture I'm present. Usually what will happen is a philosopher will present a big picture and then hope you identify with it. But Hegel's saying, hold on to it. Hegel's saying, here's a big picture. This, you know, chew on it for a bit. It might help you get somewhere. And then when you're done, make sure to go to the washroom and clean up, that type of thing. So like, but I also want to answer Max's question, because I'm going to give like specific details about that again in the class itself. But what I want to offer is a more general methodological tool that I use, which I picked up from Zizek's Less Than Nothing, which is the logic of retroactive interpretation as a thought experiment. So this is basically saying, when we usually interpret the history of philosophy, we'll say, what did Nietzsche think about Hegel? But the methodological retroactivity is, what would Hegel think about Nietzsche? So like, because you can never have dead philosophers answer the people who negate them after they're dead, right? So so obviously we can't bring back Hegel to life to get the answer, but we can nonetheless use that as a thought experiment. And the reason why I'm giving that is because I think that that's very useful in general. Like, so for example, like Zizek will often say things like, we know what Aristotle thought of Plato, but what would Plato think about Aristotle? Right? Or so we flip the traditional narrative of philosophy. And I think this is very genius, and I think that we can get new ideas by taking this to its extreme. But I'll ask the next question is from Actual Spirit, who says, why does Nietzsche say one should not talk about women with women? Thomas, I know you want to answer this one. No.
Yeah, I think that this came up. I mentioned it briefly in the conversation we had. You know, like when aspects of like texts where Nietzsche has like a short section on women, you know, and like you read it and it's like, oh, I can't talk about women to women, but then there's an old woman and the old woman says, well, I'm old, so it's fine.
Yeah.
And it's like going through like the four sections before, it's like, oh yeah, there's like an essential thought here. It's really provoking me. And then you have this section on women, you know, and it's like, okay, like I'm trying to, again, Heidegger, I'm trying to grasp the essential thinking of why we can't talk about women with women. And there are aspects where like you miss it because you're like, okay, maybe this is the 10% of Nietzsche's thinking where, you know, he is egotistical in this way. Like he's in his culture, in his place, in his time, you know.
The historicization. So like the thing I would push back a little bit there on with is that apparently Nietzsche really did love sort of like the feminists of his day. Like he wasn't necessarily arguing for or defending like the traditional worldview of women. I think he did want sort of he was pushing in an emancipatory direction with women. But I think what he was like against was kind of like the decharging or the losing of tension between men and women. Like, so he wanted to get, like, my interpretation would be he wanted to get out of the traditional boxes, but he didn't want to lose the polarity.
Yeah, you find this in a lot of his letters, right? It's like he's standing for the pathos of distance between the gender roles, and he's also asking the proto-feminists who he supports to think really clearly and critically about what they're assuming an increase of power for women would actually be like. Because they may be falling under some kind of system that actually represents a devaluation of feminine power because it's being interpreted through a non-sustainable moralistic lens. I think there's a funny way in which he's doing a thing all the philosophers do, which is play with the yin-yang, masculine, feminine modes of exploring reality, right? And in Beyond Good and Evil, he has this beautiful passage where he makes fun of himself and then says, look, I've insulted myself, I've insulted philosophers, so now I can go ahead and say some things that might be insulting about women. It's a beautifully sly bit of passage. But when he talks about the feminine, one of the things he's pointing to in the feminine is this quality of deceptive ornamentation and this tendency to not be interested as much in some kind of objective structural analysis if that conflicts with your the power that you get from making things look and feel nice. Right? I had a situation at my cousin's wedding years ago, and she went to get ready for the wedding, and my mother went with her, and they were in this room for like 5 hours getting the clothing ready. And when they came out, I said, you've got to explain to me the logic that went into this. You guys were in there for a long time. I'd like to know. And they both said, oh, we just put on whatever we had. And I'm like, that is clearly not an explanation of what went on for 5 hours in testing the clothing. But they didn't want to reveal it to me for some reason. Right. So an instinct which is not dominant in everybody who has a vagina, but it's characteristic of some version of the feminine, wanted to put a veil in front of that. And if you want to come to women, let's say, and say, here's a potentially offensive and upsetting structural analysis of how women are, that's going to strike a lot of the feminine in all of us as, well, why would you do that? That's gross. Just make it sound good and don't tell us about the structure.
Yeah. So in a way, it's a kind of affirmation of femininity, you know?
Yeah.
But then, of course, when it comes to like why one should not talk about women with women, it becomes a very specific question where we don't have the answer in a way, unless you can do like sit down and focus on the text and think about Nietzsche's work as a whole.
Yeah.
Like I can't give an answer to this, but then I think through his work, you can trust his affirmation, you know, of life in general, which includes all forms of life, you know.
There's a weird passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is connected to not an engagement with an actual human woman, but with what is unmistakably a feminine type of spirit, which he calls life. And life, he's in some sort of like poetic disagreement or some poetic antagonism with this feminine spirit. And the feminine spirit's laughing at him, saying that you men with your ideas of life, and I just wash them away and I just laugh at them. And then after this sort of dance has gone on, Nietzsche's sort of left feeling empty and barren and naked. So there's this idea that kind of like what I would say is like there's a type of masculinity which stands in its own, which tries to stand in his own ideas about things without really embedding them within the spirit of life, which is ultimately undescribable and unexplainable and cannot be closed and cannot be finalized. I think he's trying to get to this space.
Yeah, two things pop out for me there. One is it's sort of like saying, listen, when you're on psychedelics, don't talk about psychedelics.
Right.
Another part of it is, a little bit more toward the Lacanian side, which is if you have a good conversation with a woman about women, then in a way she's a man in that conversation, right? She's not the other one. She's the one.
Trying to explain and give a framework,
Yeah, and I've actually had that experience. I can say that without giving away too many details, I've had the experience of sort of being in a situation where I'm capable of analyzing women with a woman, and it does decharge the sexual connection. So I think that there is some truth to that. Actual Spirit also asks, was Nietzsche a right winger?
I think within the time period he was writing, there wasn't really a distinction between right wing and left wing in the first place.
Well, French Revolution.
Okay, yeah, like in terms of like
French Revolution gave that distinction. I think let's say the traditional distinction, as I understand it, is that right wing stands for a certain type of traditional sacred hierarchy, and the left wing stands for the equality of all peoples, or something like that. So there's usually a tension between this drive for equality and this drive for authority structures and hierarchy.
But I would say, just one quick point. I think the point is his whole philosophy is a radical destructuring in all instances. So I think in that sense, he's a radical thinker who goes beyond even the dichotomy of right and left, because he wants to show how they are values in themselves which don't hold up. And I think this is why he, like some other thinkers who follow him, are apolitical.
Yeah.
So this is his critique of socialism, because it's another new framework in which we're trying to capture the world and orientate ourselves around an idea which is other than life, So in that sense, but there are moments in his text when he explicitly talks about how racism itself is one of the most disgusting forms of value attribution, because you're essentializing another human being based upon some fundamental characteristic that they do or do not have, And I think the thing is as well, what might be quite interesting to think with Nietzsche is that his sister had a major influence on his posthumous publications, because she was in charge and she was explicitly involved with the early fascist movement. And so there's a lot of textual analysis about those texts which were published after, how his work was framed, because I think it's been made quite obvious that she had a heavy involvement with reprinting certain sections and placing his work in such a way where then people can say, Hitler was persuaded by Nietzsche because Hitler saw in Nietzsche a type of Übermensch, a type of claim to a new type of German culture. So you can see how these threads connect. But I think, again, it's like with anything. Heidegger's a very different question, because he was explicitly in the Nazi party. So that's a very difficult subject, especially after his Black Notebooks came out. But I think with Nietzsche, we can follow his essential thinking to see how he really radicalizes everything. In that sense, he's a leftist, in my opinion, because he radicalizes everything so much where, think about the gender debate today, it's like the very destruction between dichotomies, So there are a lot of contemporary feminists who would constantly use Nietzsche's nihilism to talk about how these valuations between left and right are themselves unstructured. Yeah,
I have a lot of background with the integral politics and metamodern politics communities where levels or cultural codes are distinguished from healthy and unhealthy, which is distinguished from a right and left polarization that's applicable to all scales of things. So Nietzsche is definitely not a mythic membership conservative in that sense, right? He's very much against German nationalism and racism and all this kind of a lot of stuff we would point to in the media today as being kind of reactionary, regressive right wingers. He has no interest in that. And he is very progressive in some respects. He's very supportive of change. The will to power itself is a transformative, world-altering impulse. Like you were saying, he's very friendly with a lot of the proto-feminists. He's looking to the future. There's something very progressive and left about that. Bard points to these points of communion between Nietzsche and Marx, right? And I think it's very plausible, not at all out of the question, to build up a very left-wing Nietzsche. Just as it's very plausible to build up a very transpartisan Nietzsche who is somehow above the fray or builds a hybridization, goes beyond our normal political polarizations. But there is a way to think about Nietzsche, as I sometimes do, as being an advanced conservative in some sense, because he's interested in, obviously, history and tradition. Right, and his philology and his historical analysis of the deep thinkers of the past and the wisdom they have to bring forward. He's obsessed with, in a way, tradition, with the past, with the complexity of the world. And one of the things that's typical of different kinds of conservatism, I think, is the respect for what we don't know and what we don't understand, and the need to use heuristic understandings to deal with complexity, rather than to imagine, as some liberals do, that we've made all the implicit knowledge explicit and then we have a system that governs anything and we can just run it. Nietzsche doesn't think that. He's much more open to the kind of mysteries of the world, the difficulties and complexities that conservatives often point to. And conservatives point to it in a very simplistic way of like, well, we shouldn't interfere with the pregnancy process, or we shouldn't interfere with the ecosystem, or whatever it is. They have some fantasy about why we shouldn't get involved. But in that fantasy, there's a deep respect for the complexity and the informational opacity of the world. So I might put him in the same class of conservatives as like Nassim Taleb and Edmund Burke. Right? If they're all conservatives, that's pretty plausible, but it's a very high level of conservative that has almost nothing in common with, say, an American right-winger today.
Yeah, it's hard to situate Nietzsche on a political spectrum, and I think that's especially a conventional political spectrum, and I think that's why you see people from all dimensions of the political spectrum become attracted to Nietzsche and try to use Nietzsche in whatever way they can. I think like what I'll say in terms of the conventional understandings of left and right, that I think Nietzsche goes against both in some sense, although I do understand and I do find quite compelling what Layman's saying about Nietzsche as an advanced conservative. At the same time, I think on the value side of the left, when it comes to egalitarianism, Nietzsche really has no time for this whatsoever. I mean, he's really building a philosophy that's organized towards greatness, and he definitely emphasizes people striving for greatness and emphasizing that will produce inequalities, and that those inequalities are in some sense a natural right. And when it comes to the right wing in regards to sort of deifying certain traditional hierarchies, I think that he explicitly develops a philosophy where he's constantly breaking tables and encouraging you to break tables and encouraging you, don't just identify with the value structures and the value systems of a given. I mean, he spends like a lot of thus spoke Zarathustra calling scholars and priests just complete bollocks, right? Like, just get rid of it.
But also he's not sending that message to everyone. He's not proposing that be the normal rule of life. Because he does have personally, I think he has a great care for the folk, right? In a sense that the world of inequalities and the world in which there are new power possessors and new kinds of philosophers who obey his instructions or injunctions, that's also a world in which there is a great mass of people who need their communities to function, who need sort of a mythic potency, some kind of coherence, some kind of spirit together. And they don't have to know about all these things all the time. Right. And I think that's also a very conservative mood, which is conservatives do have a tolerance for inequality, but they also have a great spirit of interest and sympathy for the populism of the mass, for the folk spirit of the people.
And do you see that in Nietzsche?
I do. And I would point to, I think I mentioned it in the car conversation, in Julian Jung's Nietzsche and Religion, Nietzsche's Philosophy of Religion. He really goes through and pulls that out. Now, Nietzsche doesn't emphasize it. I see it more in Nietzsche's character and personal relations than in his thinking, but you can definitely draw a narrative of his concern for the folk. He's not proposing that everybody's supposed to be the overman. Only the people who are willing to work on that project and who are built to work on that project are to do that. So that's where his focus is. But it's not like he has no care or no interest in all the rest of the people and they should just be destroyed or something like that. They should have a kind of life that, because my view is he's trying to think his way towards a peak experience maximizing civilization. Right. And there's two ways to maximize peak experiences. One is for some people to get way better at having more of them more deeply. And another way is for many people to be healthy and coordinated and organized in a way that there's a more proliferating sense of peak experiences, right? That the will to power wants more people to experience more empowerment. And for some people, that's super deep empowerment. And for a lot of people, that's widespread generalized empowerment.
I think what interests me on that point is how, to go back to what you said, Cadell, like as well about like he's destroying all of the tables, and I think this kind of connects to some readings of like anarchism, for example. How anarchism
many anarchists who were appealed by Nietzsche.
Exactly.
Many anarchists appealed.
Yep. A constant upheaval of all frameworks. But then I think anarchism relies on a trust about the human possibility and the possibility potentially of all human beings being able to be capable for being the overman. And I think this is a good question, and it's a question worth going into in Nietzsche, is how far does he place that potentiality for everybody? You know,
It's an open question, yeah.
Can we all be trusted to not have structures and coexist together? I think the conservative element at that point, based upon the idea of trust, can also become its opposite. You know, it's the anarchism.
I mean, I do get the impression. I don't know if his view. I'll say, at least in my reading of this book, Zarathustra, it does seem like his view matures a little bit in terms of who he's targeting to be the overman. But when he first comes down from the mountains, he's just targeting everyone. He's just in the market, and then it does get more specified. But did you want to say something more, Layman?
Yeah, I would just say that mirrors his whole developmental arc, right? That what Zarathustra does is realize that he was hasty and in a way crass in trying to think of everyone. And he shifts to a smaller group, and then in some ways an even smaller group. And Nietzsche's own work, like when you read in Ecce Homo, the critiques he levels towards Birth of Tragedy, it's one of the critiques is it sort of smells a little bit too much like it's for everybody. It smells a little bit gross to him. He was thinking too much of the general culture being transformed, right? And that doesn't mean he doesn't have any care for the general culture, but he's realized that what he's talking about is something much more specific with a much higher bar for entry.
Kind of reminds me of how you were talking about the tantric gurus of the 20th century, where there's these little sort of groups of people who are really hyper concentrated on their spiritual development, but it's not necessarily something, like I just think about the conflict that was produced in Portland with Osho's community and the surrounding community, which was extremely disturbed by it. I don't know. There is something I wanted to say about just it seems to me like there is a conversation to be had about the way in which Nietzsche's politics can be interpreted almost in relationship to what you want to do with it. Like it can do so much, and it's easy for me to think of things or think of ways in which I could make a right wing Nietzsche, or I could make a left wing Nietzsche. But in any case, I think there's more questions. So the next question is also from Actual Spirit, who says, is the Overman at the end of the day a mental point of reference, or a mental point of reference indefinitely postponed, or is it to be actualized? Is the Overman a process of coming to be for Nietzsche?
I think
so. Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, no, just like this whole idea of like actualizing the mental point of reference, I think in itself it presupposes that there's an idea that we can have about who we might become. And I think Nietzsche's whole critique is the idea that we think we can actualize that idea, because then that in itself is a form of postponing. That in itself is a form of placing our existence in life towards something else. And I think that's the whole critique of nihilism, his whole critique of evaluations, because we're creating a dichotomy between where we are now and where we ought to become as being an overman. So my reading of Nietzsche is to enjoy this idea that we have about what we might become, whilst knowing that that idea is itself illusionary. It's an image that we can play with. Going back to what we said about this egotism, is this idea of I'm aware of my idea as being an illusion, but I can affirm that for what purpose? Where is this idea leading me? And I think for Nietzsche, and this is my reading, Nietzsche's affirmation of mental points of references is not so we can actualize those ideas, but it's for those ideas to bring us back to where we are now, into the process of coming to be. So I think like images are there to always bring us back, or to postpone us, or to distract us, And I think this is why it's beyond good and evil, because it's not saying like, hey, there's a correct idea or there's a wrong idea. It's about which ideas affirm our present place where we are here and now in becoming. And I think this is why it's about usefulness and utility and helpfulness for affirmation, life affirmation. And I think a good reference to that is The Birth of Tragedy, when he talks about the art of, and I think this goes back to what we said about the Dionysian and on the other side you have this obsession with logos, logic, the idea, the mental point of reference. It's a form of art, but only if it then reaffirms the constant state of becoming in which we are already in. And I think that's a useful way to see how it's not just like one or the other. It's not just the idea or the actualization of the idea. It's the playfulness which shows us that there was no difference in the first place. Maybe that's my interpretation of this. But it's a very good question. I think I think it opens up how there can be different interpretations of what the overman means for Nietzsche, because there are different interpretations. But I just cited an interpretation which is always annihilating images towards where we are now. And again, that's my reading. It's very, in that sense, postmodern, because it's always about just constantly annihilating instead of trying to actualize an idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there are definitely different layers or different ways of interpreting this. The most straightforward is that it's a voluntary fantasy, right? That even Zarathustra says, he's telling people that the overman should be the purpose of existence. He sort of says, let your will say that the overman should be the purpose of existence, right? You're going to opt in. You're going to voluntarily pick this up as a useful fantasy for the future.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a philosophical dimension to it, where the difference between attainability and endless deference into the future is itself collapsed, in the way that the difference between being and becoming is collapsed. I do a lot of thinking around the metaphysics of adjacency. And so the idea is like the thing you think is going to be the actual point of existence is itself structured as a deferral. So those things are not fundamentally a dichotomy. I would say that from the sort of transcendentalist spiritual perspective, there is a sense in which that move can be accomplished in a way. Part of that is a mode of interpretation. Like Zen Master Dogen says, you don't sit down and meditate to become the Buddha. You sit down and meditate because you are the Buddha. Right. So there's a sense in which it is attainable, and the attainment is already presupposed in that act. But I would say there's coming at it from this religious, spiritual impression of Nietzsche, and thinking of Nietzsche saying in the notebooks, that religion comes from people having experiences of overflowing power that feel divine and not being able to handle that, and so projecting that onto a god. There is a process of spiritual transformation accompanied by psychoanalytic maturation, whereby you become more and more capable of recognizing yourself as the source of that overflowing power. And I think we have seen throughout mystic history some characters who sort of radically changed their experience of being a human being, that mutated themselves in the direction of being, I am the source of value. I am the overflowing of the empowerment experience. And that's such a radical rupture with normal human experience that I would say it is, at least in principle, attainable to be the ultra-human.
Yeah, but maybe on that specific point, it's attained by knowing that you are already what you're trying to attain. And so I think what Nietzsche does, and I think this connects to Hegel, like we pass through the idea of this as a form of cultivation, just to realize what we were already. This is why the idea for Hegel is so important. This is why I think images for Nietzsche are so important. And I think this is why there is a bridge between the last man and the overman. There is a bridge, but the bridge itself is to be annihilated in a way, not to be transgressed as if we have to become something like a point of reference. Like we see the other side of the bridge. We have to strive as human beings towards like the perfect condition, because this is like the right-wing reading, like we have to become, we have to do, we have to be the image, we have to live out the image. But I think what you've highlighted there is you don't meditate because you want to become the Buddha. It's just meditation is a way to recognize that you are already what you were trying to achieve,
And I would just pair that with the thing the thing that you are, that you were trying to achieve, that you already always are, is itself displaced and has the shape of a becoming. What you always already are is not quite yourself. right? And that's a place you actually can land to some degree, but to land there doesn't look like landing somewhere as opposed to being on a journey of becoming.
Mm-hmm.
All right, yeah, that's okay. More questions. Max asks, is Nietzsche not too dangerous for many people? I feel a lot of people gut his real radicalism, particularly in relation to liberal democracy, egalitarianism, and modernity. So basically, yeah, is Nietzsche too dangerous for many people, and is he sort of pacified or gutted in relation to liberal democracy, egalitarianism, and modernity? Good question.
I would say from people I've met over the years and their interpretation of Nietzsche, it's like kind of what you said before. It's like picking and choosing aspects of his thinking which have a usefulness for something. And I think what the question is there, like the real radicalism makes all of those things impossible in a way, as things to be attained. Like if we're trying to attain liberal democracy, Nietzsche comes in his radical manner to say, well, what you're aiming for is itself an illusion, And I think otherwise it's just to pick and choose. And I think from people I know and the way they read Nietzsche, like with other thinkers, they go past them quite quickly because they've had this particular interpretation of the way he was, his time period, Like he was cynical. He was just a playful master who just kind of we can use to critique some things, then we move on to the serious business, I think what I've enjoyed with him mostly since reading him, but more so the last years, is how he has that in the question, like the real radicalism. And like you said, Cadell, which is why he can critique egalitarianism, because he's trying to critique not just egalitarianism, but the very framework in which that's like something to be attained, like as if that's the goal to life,
Mm-hmm.
Because then it's drying up life becomes dry and cold. And yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I think he's not too dangerous in the sense that we shouldn't be making sure the wrong people don't read him. But he is very dangerous. He's dangerous to our ability to understand, especially to understand within a certain phase of cultural history, right? I think it's very plausible to make that Barton Soderquist move and say that Nietzsche is like a precursor of the kind of meta-modern network society thinking that's needed for the future, and that if you're in traditional modern or even postmodern cultural contexts, you can't really make sense of what he's talking about, right? To exist under the conditions of capital, let's say, makes it very hard for you to figure out what this guy's talking about, because what he's talking about is something that comes from outside that frame. He's tunneled through that wall to some degree. Now, so there's a sacred membrane there. It doesn't have to be enforced, but people should be careful in thinking that they can simply understand him, when clearly what he's talking about comes from outside the frame of most people's psychological and social and techno-economic framework.
And I think any danger there would either be a complete misreading and using him for the purposes of like promoting a new type of person, which is like true. But if you take it at that level, you're going to have big problems, because you're going to reaffirm like the ideal characteristic of who somebody should be, as if they have, a capability for this idea. I think, again, this goes back to the point that Nietzsche is always destructuring, annihilating ideas that we have about ourselves. And that's the place of the overman. That's the place where all of these characteristics of the overman flourish. And I did want to say something else, but yeah, okay, it's dangerous for those frameworks which are already existing,
Our tendency to not want to be misunderstood, right? There's a sense of like, oh, well, what if people read Nietzsche and they don't get what he's saying? But he's almost the first major thinker to try to give himself a positive attitude toward being misunderstood, right? And that's one of the things he challenges, that we have a background assumption that we want people to understand us, and if they misunderstand us, that's a bad thing. And he's, of course, he's the easiest philosopher to misunderstand. He goes out of his way to make himself easy to misunderstand, and that's emotionally painful. But he's also trying to show us that that's okay. It's okay to be misunderstood, which is very that's a pertinent lesson for the age of the YouTube comment section.
It's poetry. Because it's always taking away the foundation from which we think we can say that this person said this, or he said this, or she did this, Maybe they did, but then like, for what reason? Is it affirming life, or is it negating from life?
Yeah, so I would say yes, he's too dangerous, but go ahead and be endangered by it.
All right. The next question is from Actual Spirit, who says, in the philosophy of religion, Hegel claims that God is love. What is love for Nietzsche? And I just want to sort of give maybe an addition to that when Hegel says God is love, he's also saying that love would become insipid if it wasn't understood as a sort of a challenging love, a self-disporting with itself, this type of thing. But in any case, the real question here seems to be, what is love for Nietzsche?
Mm-hmm.
No pressure.
I'm going to give a 5-word answer in a way. It's a love for what is. But then what is not just like a state of being. It's like the constant appearing and disappearing. And that's amor fati, like the love of what is fated, meaning everything that is for you right here, right now is to be loved in its radicality. Because then that's the place where then the way you experience the world and view the world or life is an engagement. It's a proactive enjoyment to then change things which might not be loved. So I think love is simply like the exhibition of what is already.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I would come at it from maybe 3 angles, and one of them is certainly that acceptance and the attempt to intentionalize or volunteer for the affirmation of what is. That's a huge part of how he understands love. Second part is obviously interpersonally, he didn't get a lot of nourishing love the way we might think about it today from a therapeutic point of view. His family was not great in being emotionally supportive. His relationships with friends and women, and it was all very problematic. He wasn't a guy who got a lot. If love was a, say, line of developmental intelligence, he didn't get a lot of rich experience along that line. But I would add one third thing, which is the notion of a person being powerful, being an extension of the evolutionary will to power by bringing all of their contradictions and even their weaknesses into some kind of internal coherence, where there's a resonance between these things, even though they contradict and disagree with each other. I think that's part of how he understands love. Right? That love between individuals, between men and women, is a way of embracing difference, embracing the pathos of distance, and nonetheless establishing a workable resonance that creates a kind of overflowing sense of potency despite or because of the contradiction.
All right, great explanation there. Doug Vogel from Facebook asks, looking at the distinctive traits of the Overman, who in our current society would exemplify this model? And is the Overman an archetype? Anyone want to jump on that one?
Who isn't like a specific person, or?
He's saying, looking at the distinctive traits of the Overman, who in our current society would exemplify this model? Is there a model of the Overman today? Well, I think like the Overman is pointing beyond the human species. The Overman is constantly attempting to self-overcome. The Overman is taking great risks. The Overman is capable of striving for greatness and in high levels of conflict and tension. And there are many 20th century political figures or activist figures, like I'm thinking about Gandhi or Martin Luther King come to mind, or Nelson Mandela are like famous examples, who I would see as kind of embodying a type of drive in this direction. They're not necessarily contemporary figures, but they're certainly post-Nietzschean.
Contemporary is tricky because we don't have all the information about them that we would gain with hindsight. So I would hesitate on contemporary figures. I think you can look back through the 20th century and see a number of characters who are pretty radical, pretty risky, pretty adventurous. I look at certain characters from like the tantric religious history of the 20th century. Well, there's, Gurdjieff is an interesting example. Maybe Adida is an interesting example. Maybe Chogyam.
Shout out Osho.
Yeah, right. These are people who are taking risks. These are people who've experienced their humanity in a way that's almost radically inhuman.
Yeah.
People who seem to embody a sense of empowerment in their daily experience that goes beyond the kind of power that people are normally trying to negotiate their access to. So that's a place to look. But at the same time, it is an eternally displaced goal to be the overman. And I think we shouldn't be too hasty in thinking of like great political figures or something like that, specifically because of, Cadell, you and I talked about this, the Ass Festival section at the end of Zarathustra. He talks about sort of approximating and aligning toward the overman by getting the higher men to, have a more relaxed, humorous sensibility about themselves. But I think what you see in a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King is what he would call the higher men, but not the overman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is the thing we're talking about political figures, because they're taking what they're doing very seriously, because they see it as kind of like the meta narrative that needs to be installed, So like if you have a political figure that has a program, even if they're courageous, even if they're breaking boundaries, in a way, I think following Nietzsche's idea of the overman, what you said about like displacement and placement, if they're trying to place something, even if they're courageous, even if they're breaking boundaries, if they're then attempting to place something again, a new value system, maybe there's a bit of skepticism in me which says, well, they're the overman in their characteristics, but when it comes to being this constant person who's this person who's constantly displacing things, have we actually seen an overman today? Are we still waiting? Do we have to wait?
And would we be able to recognize it if we saw it?
Oh yeah, probably not.
Well, I think they would probably be seen as potentially an alien enemy of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're
the most dangerous.
We're better suited to look for examples in fiction, right? That on the one hand, Hannibal Lecter comes to mind, and in the sense that Nietzsche talks about the overman as being a little bit like Christ and a little bit like Cesare Borgia. I think if you ever saw the show Dollhouse by Joss Whedon, about these people who take the imprints of different personalities and then serve temporary functions, but one or two of them start to experience all of their different personality imprints simultaneously, and they get this kind of multi-personality, multi-perspectival network experience of themselves that causes something like a radical inhuman rupture to normal identity experience. So I think there's a lot of that in science fiction, for example, and not so much in the world around us that we would experience through the news.
Yeah, because if somebody's on the news, they're probably there with a purpose,
Yeah.
And having a purpose is kind of the opposite of having all of these personalities rupture. Yeah,
Exactly.
So they would be an alien in that sense.
Actual Spirit asks, question for Layman, when is your book on Nietzsche coming out?
As soon as somebody offers me an advance to get to work on it.
All right. So if you know anyone out there, Actual Spirit, Layman's waiting an offer.
Throw some money at me. I'll write one.
There you go. All right. Max Mackin asks, in Sloterdijk's Spheres, he talks about civilizations as greenhouses with illusions and delusions that are life-affirming sources for civilizations. They live off these illusions. How do you think Nietzsche relates to this in relation to the death of God and anti-discrimination and anti-racism becoming the fundamental value of Western civilization? Is this value sustainable?
Can you repeat the second part of this? Because I can see on the second.
The first part is about civilizations are greenhouses of illusions and delusions that are life-affirming sources of civilizations. They live off these illusions. The second part is, how does this relate to Nietzsche's death of God and our anti-discrimination and anti-racism becoming the fundamental value of Western civilization? Is this value sustainable?
I think the first part kind of relates to the main thing I'm interested in, these postmodern interpretations, or one main postmodern interpretation of Gianni Vattimo, who reads the death of God as not the literal death of all values, where we're stuck in this pure illusion. He would say the very space in which we needed God is literally just changed to where we can interpret the world around us for pragmatic reasons. So we still live like this first part of the question, we live within illusions, and the question is, are those illusions affirming life, or are they negating life? Are they affirming? So that focuses on things like charity. It's not about the truth of charity, whether it's good to be charitable, not in the sense of having organizations that give money to people, but in the sense of how we approach each other, each being that we approach. So his concern is our view of that person affirming their beingness, through illusion. So the question is like, how does illusion after the death of God affirm the space where God is no longer, in which people move and place themselves, and we have our interpretations of them. But in terms of like the movements we find today with anti-discriminatory, I think the question in that sense then is it affirming life or is it negating life? If you're telling people to stop saying stuff because it has an effect on other people, are you doing that with the intention of affirming life? Because at the beginning it sounds like it, or in the end, are you just negating what Layman is like the will to power, like the increase in the will to power, or are you minimizing that will to power? And most of the time it seems like it's a minimization, it's closing off, it's a putting a boundary around certain behavior types, and it's like reinstating this system of morality that then I think this is why Nietzsche is against a system of morality, not because he doesn't want to affirm aspects of life, but because he would say if we get caught up in the morality and the moral judgments in and for themselves, we're negating life. So the illusion negates life in that sense.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. Nietzsche has a very comprehensive notion of what's an illusion. Right, the O Sanctus Simplicitas section really talks about it's not like illusion is just some social lies we tell each other. Our very perception is a deception as well. And then the question is not whether or not we should live in illusion. We have no choice. So is it a healthy illusion or an unhealthy illusion? Does it serve our empowerment or not serve our empowerment? And then that becomes a mixed answer at all points. Right, there was a utility in certain historical phases and for certain individuals, perhaps still today, in the illusion of God. The illusion of anti-discrimination or anti-racism could be very useful. It could empower sections of the population. It could empower individuals. It could be a bridge toward a planetary society that needs illusions that go beyond ethnocentric divisions of the species. But at the same time, we obviously see a lot of people using it in very unhealthy ways. So it's not that the form of the illusion is itself problematic or unproblematic. It's the use we make of it. And a lot of Nietzsche's thought is around the use and exploitation of things and not so much what they are. Like Deleuze would say, Nietzsche's not asking what is it, but which one is it? And that's part of the right. So which use of anti-discrimination as an illusion is being spoken of in any given moment? It might be the healthy one or the unhealthy one.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to his idea of the body and physiology and how we affirm our beingness as a being and affirm the beingness of other beings around us, to allow other people to be healthy. And that in a way is kind of like the liberal aspect of his thinking, I think. Yeah. And I think this is, again, like this came up in the other conversation. This is why he comes down from the mountain, because he sees the freedom of other people being healthy in affirming their own being away from the illusion which places God as the other, towards the illusion of maybe everything already being spiritualized in their own frenzy, in their own And I think this is important. I think this is the whole point of Beyond Good and Evil. It's not just to say, oh, we fall to complete nothingness. We fall to where we recognize that all of these illusions were always illusions, but even now the new values that we have will also be illusions. And then the question becomes in a way a bit pragmatic. How, but not towards like a new future goal, but towards the affirmation of where you find your body.
Yeah.
I think this is what Deleuze gets, I think, from what I've learned more recently, where he talks about, is it bodies without organs, It's affirming your place within life. and other people's as
that
well.
active affirmation versus a reactive deficiency mode seems to be essential, right? Is the body and is the illusion something that presents us with a deficiency that has to be reactively corrected? Or is it something that's totally effective and we can embrace it and affirm it in a way that overflows? And so the illusion itself becomes more full of power than it seems to be able to contain. And therefore it has a truth to it, which it has the capacity to give us empowerment. So like that's Nietzsche's distinction all the way
through. It reminds me of the focus he puts on the body. Sorry. When he talks about like going to particular cities, I think he talks about Florence, where it has the clear air.
Yeah.
Like there's no humidity in Florence in a way. So like when he's there, he's able to think in the highest form of illusions.
Yeah.
Where he's just constantly aware of his illusion. But like and this is what he means, like there's this constant self-awareness, but not of like a true self, but of the fact that he's always painting in illusions.
Yeah.
But then and that's the point. I think this came up again in the last conversation, where it's at that point where you realize that even if they're illusions, they are also life.
Yeah.
Because the very dichotomy is dissolved, you know? I think it's that place where even the distinction between life and illusion is dissolved.
Yeah, and the attitudinal transformation that facilitates that dissolving is at the core of his work. And La Gea Scienza, this notion that there's a happy science. Now, science is in a way premised upon the notion that we're moving from illusions to fewer illusions. But in his mode, you're not. You're moving toward maybe better illusions, healthier illusions, more effective illusions. But you have to be comfortable with the fact that it's illusion, and you have to get on board with a good conscience so that you can be the gay scientist, not the scientist who's just suffering the absence of illusion or holding on to the weird illusion that you've somehow escaped all illusions.
Yeah, exactly. Well said.
Right on. So the next question, again from Max, is what stages do you guys think are in Nietzsche's development? I feel like this is like set up for Layman here.
Yeah, I don't want to be too heavy with the spiral dynamics integral stage stuff because that's
Give us the Wilbur there. Give us the Wilbur there.
I mean, it's hard to know because we're mostly only judging from his written materials, not his unwritten life. But I think there's definitely there's a retro-romantic sensibility to Birth of Tragedy that he tries to deliberately correct with a move toward a more modern, humanistic, rational, scientific approach in some of the mid-range books. So I think there's sort of a pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional phase of Nietzsche in that sense. I would say definitely everything beyond Zarathustra is in a different category than that middle range. So first he seems to have this what seems to be a mixture of reactive, regressive anti-modernism with some intelligence trying to go beyond it. And then he tries to sort of dry out and goes into this middle phase of really inhabiting the scientific world that we live in today. And then he gets to this post-conventional stage where he's resolved the questions in a way. He's found the spirit or the tempo or the way of being and writing and addressing things that solves the problem he was looking at earlier. So, obviously, the simplest way to do stage development is just to do three, a pre, a conventional, and a post-conventional, rather than to break him down into this is where he was a traditionalist and this is where he was a formal operational cognitivist. But I would say, yeah, there's a very simple way to look at him as having at least three major phases.
Thomas, do you have anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I think it's this. I think what interests me the most is the post-conventional, mystical period, and I think even in Heidegger, after his turn, I think there's kind of like another turn which puts him in the third phase as well, where he becomes also quite mystical, because I think it's in these periods in both thinkers and now back to Nietzsche, where he focuses on the illusion of the illusion. He focuses on the joy of what this means, I think. So then he becomes more interested in interpretation of poetry and of like a pure provocation, And I think it's there that I find personally my biggest joy. Yeah, I think it's nice to start with this. So if anybody's like getting into Nietzsche now, it's nice to go to these later texts in a way first. to see this kind of conclusive attitude, because I think in a way this reveals that overcoming nihilism brings with it this sort of comportment or this attitude that Nietzsche has. Even in Heidegger's later thought, it's really affirming of everything. So even for Heidegger, he affirms the forgetfulness of what metaphysics did to our culture. Like he affirms it, because without it, we wouldn't have found being as an event for Heidegger. I know just going away from Nietzsche, but even in Nietzsche, he's affirming everything. He's affirming the illusion to say within that affirmation, there's this joy. You know, you can be the happy scientist. You can be ready for your own cultivation of who you already are. You can become who you are with this joyful spirit. With this, I think I mentioned in the conversation, talks about how, in reflecting on the birth of tragedy, he says to his young spirit, "Oh, how you should have laughed."
Yeah.
So instead of trying to provide like an artist's metaphysics, he says you should have just laughed. You should have just had joy, and like with light feet, you could have stepped forward. You know.
Yeah.
Instead of having to write the book for like pleasing Wagner with a certain intention, you know, framework within a certain framework. Yeah, it's a nice way. You've said that really well with like this.
No, I agree that it's the post-conventional that's most exciting, when he's in a way, a pious Dionysian at last, you know, and there's so much self-confessed joy and clarity and a sense of a person really having found their own character and their own flavor. But I like that you mentioned Wagner, because that's another way you could break up his life in stages, right? There's a pre-Wagner stage, and then there's a Wagner stage, and then there's a wrestling with Wagner, and then there's a really post-Wagner stage, which is the beautiful, when he really comes into his own.
Yeah, it's fantastic. The idea I've been playing with for a while is this relationship between seriousness and jokes, or seriousness and humor. And what's coming to my mind is this distinction between Osho and Krishnamurti, where they had different interpretations of enlightenment, where Krishnamurti had a more serious interpretation of enlightenment. Like, we got to get down to serious discussions now about like what is the being and what is becoming, and let's have, like, you know, he had those deep dives with Bohm, where it's like very serious discussion. Like, you can see Krishnamurti has like pain in his voice almost. But Osho is saying enlightenment is comedy. Like, enlightenment should be entertainment, he said. And I was thinking there should be some sort of, I was doing some research on Zizek, and he seems to have some sort of synthesis about this, where he says the seriousness should be inside jokes. So it's kind of like the jokes sublate seriousness, but it's not just empty jokes. It's like you communicate very serious things inside the joke. And I just wonder if there's any relationship with that, and what you guys were talking about you should laugh at yourself and you should
yeah, I think it goes back to what Layman said about, I'm going to use the word cultivating the overman. The cultivation is a joke. Like, it can be seen as a joke, but within that joke, it does something serious, because it brings you to, it crosses you over the bridge, you know, which is a very serious thing. Because if you look at the condition of the last man, of how we in our society are relating to the world today, it's serious business, you know. Like, it's like, and this is the thing with Krishnamurti that I've got from him. Like, it's a seriousness that sees ahead of it, like, the potentiality for like an affirmation of the abyss, or a being with the abyss, you know. I think with Zizek, maybe if he's affirming seriousness through the framework of a joke, it's playing with this aspect, like you said, of both, by saying that we can talk about things which are serious, like climate change, for example. Like, Zizek encounters this a lot. But we can do so in a light spirit, because maybe the light spirit is what is needed to stop objectifying the world as something we can use as a resource, you know?
I just wonder whether this is somehow connected to the idea that in certain political climates, tense political climates, sometimes comedians can be the first ones to get attacked and pulled down, because actually there is a lot of seriousness in their jokes. Like, and it's like really, it's a political weapon. So Jay, did you want to say something, Layman?
Just the relationship between comedy and philosophy goes all the way back. And one of the things that comes up for me is the way that Nietzsche's view of humor is in a conversation with Schopenhauer's view of humor. And Schopenhauer's very thought out notion of the comic as some information that's in a category that's technically correct but functionally incorrect, right? Because it's ridiculous. But what Nietzsche added to that in his analysis of comedy, which he doesn't make a huge part emphasis on, is this idea that it's much more biophysical, that people often laugh before they've heard the punchline of a joke, and that this belies what Schopenhauer is trying to say in some sort of analytic notion of what comedy is. It's somehow a sense of, I think this is in the notebooks, that you're responding as if there's a danger, but then it turns out there isn't a danger, and your response is now excessive to the world. And so there's a sense in which if what's the energy that's coming out of you is greater than the structures of the world, then you have a liberating and humorous relationship to the structures of the world. And so if you have, let's say, high potency, self-aware, high self-esteem people who are living in a healthy way such that their system is building up a lot of extra, what we might call energy, then they're much more likely to have a humorous relationship to it. They have more, and so it can spill over and not be contained by the forms of seriousness they're always hearing about. And that's one of the things we look to our comedians to do for us, is to show us how a person can be identified with the world, identify with their own neuroses, identify with their own humiliation, and yet be fundamentally healthy enough to spill over that and embrace it in a liberating sense.
The happy Buddha.
The next question is from James Wisdom, who says, "What if the Overman is a woman?"
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the point. Yeah.
All right, maybe we'll just go on to Joseph's question.
This comes up a lot, like, because obviously the use of man, like if you read like the 18th century text, it's always about man.
Yeah.
But I think today, like, there's no distinction, like, in terms of every being. Why not?
I think he's talking to all humans here.
Yeah, animals as well. Snails.
Right. Layman, did you want to say something?
No, only that there's sometimes a woman over me, and that seems great.
All right.
Why not? Yeah.
Joseph asks, what is the connection between fascism and Nietzsche? Is this a misunderstanding of Nietzsche, or is the attempt by futurists and fascists to grapple with the vital energy of Nietzsche a genuine expression or action with his philosophy?
I think, to go back to what was said before, it's like a picking and choosing of certain aspects of what fascism is like an appeal to a type of human being which affirms some kind of inner characteristics or essential fundamental elements of what that person is. So if you're German and you have German blood, fascism is an affirmation of that blood as prioritizing your being in the world. With Nietzsche, there is no blood. There is no characteristic or value which determines who you are, because that would always play within a framework where who you think you are is who you think you are, and that's enough. Nietzsche is deconstructing that whole framework in which we think our idea of ourselves is who we actually are, because we're not just the end result of our logic. We are the body which is embedded in a becoming which in itself even takes away the idea of my body in becoming. So you can never affirm some kind of essential characteristic. So in my perspective of like this radical side, there was the question before about this radical aspect is thinking. We can never be fascist, thank God. We can never be essentialists in the Nietzschean framework. And I think anybody who takes from this, they're just kind of picking and choosing aspects of his work where he does have this conservatism, where he is promoting certain aspects of his tradition that he finds himself in, that in a way maybe he hasn't been radical enough to deconstruct himself. Like we all do, by the way. We all have our biases that we find in our culture and our place that we wrestle with when we see difference and newness and a new value that comes forward. Yeah, I think this is maybe why I mentioned anarchism before. I know that some thinkers disagree, and as I think I saw one comment before about the fact that Nietzsche himself explicitly goes against anarchism, but maybe more like the political organized form of anarchism in how it was trying to enforce the idea of a new society. But I think the whole logic of anarchism in itself is this weird self-awareness of how structures themselves can't dictate how things should be or ought to be. And that's the question in Nietzsche's thinking: can you ever be political? Which is a different question, but
yeah. There are obviously some elements of him that you can see why certain fascist movements would pick out this or that element or relate to this or that form of phrase. But I would say, roughly the same as Thomas. I would almost, I think he's a radical anti-fascist. I think that he's obviously, in terms of the emerging proto-fascism in Germany, he's against all of it, right? He hates the popular mythicism, he hates the racism, he hates German nationalism. He's vociferous in denouncing all of that stuff. It strikes him as completely misguided in terms of what he's talking about. It's not a recipe for empowerment at all. Mm-hmm. And when I, pull back and do, like somebody asked about stages earlier, if you take a developmental model, whatever you think the source of that development is, for me, fascism is all the nihilistic tendencies of a society build up to a point where it starts to mobilize to regress to a previous form of social attractor. So what we saw in modern Germany was a regress toward a kind of feudal hierophantic society, right? And that regress is very anti-Nietzschean. He's looking at how does the evolution of the will to power move forward in the world, not how does it roll backwards to a more compressed, more reactive form. That's the exact opposite of what the will to power is trying to do, and the exact opposite of the Nietzschean philosophy.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think this is a critique of common, like what Hegel would call like everyday consciousness, in how we think that when we see somebody, we immediately objectify them according to who we think they are. And so like the common sense of fascists would be, well, you're British, so you're from the north, so that's better than, So this logic is always just immediately essentializing characteristics. Whereas Nietzsche's whole polemic is to say, well, what you think is a characteristic of somebody is an illusion, And the question is, does that illusion affirm life or does it negate from life? Fascism is the pure nihilistic negation of life, because it thinks that it's getting to what's real, but actually it's just postponing the inner will to power, the energy from which we affirm our very becoming, So fascism is like a drying up of our experience, which is also massively violent and discriminatory,
Fascism moves in a deficiency mode, right? That the thing that gives us power and worth has been taken from us, and we have to respond to that somehow. So that's the slave mentality in Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche is looking for people who deconstructed themselves to the point where there's an overflow of the generative functions of value that they can move forward with.
Connected to that, Max Macken asks, how can Nietzsche help us overcome ourselves? And how does one radically listen and accept?
By realizing that the self we thought we needed to overcome was itself also an illusion.
Yeah, you said in our talk that overcoming might not be the best word for nihilism. I think you used a different word.
At
the end, you said twist or something like.
Yeah, so the German word is Verwindung. I forgot the word for overcome in German. It's like Überwindung. So like Vatimo makes Heidegger makes this distinction once or twice in his work, and Vatimo centers his whole work around this distinction between not overcoming ourself towards the real self or to life itself, because then what you're doing is you're making a distinction between you and life. So you're creating a framework in which you need to attain something or overcome something. And what you're doing, and Layman, you said this before, you're continuously postponing that moment when you overcome yourself, but not through overcoming, but just maybe by realizing that the self you thought needed overcoming, the last man, never needed overcoming. And that's when you cultivate a an awareness of that there was no distinction between you and yourself and life and everything and joy and peace, you know. And it's that moment, I think, which is the becoming for Nietzsche, which then, as we said before, is also subject to its becoming. It's also subject to its own self-overcoming. And that's nice. I think there's something, I mentioned it before, the chemical analysis of Nietzsche has this idea that when you observe chemicals reacting at their own will and joy, and you don't need to do anything. You literally do not need to actively do anything. You can watch it, and it's in the watching that you start to feel the joy and the overflowingness of the overman. So I think that's the key to overcoming, is not to overcome because you didn't need to. And that's the joy of it. That's the grace of it. I think the conversation we had before finished with this idea of grace. Like, you don't need to. You are already listening, and what you thought you needed to accept is just to be seen as an illusion. But again, and Zizek makes a good point of this at the beginning of Less Than Nothing. We don't just move away from illusions to like the vitality of life, because even that concept is just an idea as another illusion.
I think we've said that even life and the illusion becomes a distinction which falls away.
Yeah, and that's the highest illusion. But that's the active illusion which enables us to have this overcoming.
Yeah, I would maybe divide it into cognitive, emotional, and physical overcoming that Nietzsche can help us with. Cognitively, one of the main things is to help us undermine the basic assumptions that we're using to do everything else with, right? And those assumptions include the difference between reality and illusion. Those assumptions include, I was just thinking about something a second ago. I mean, the idea that you're going to get free of yourself is an idea you have to get free of.
Yeah.
But that's on the cognitive side. Emotionally, there's this element of the transvaluation of all values, which is that you have to open your heart to things that you think might undermine what you value, what you think is ideal. You have to experimentally try out the opposite of what your emotions are telling you. And physiologically, there's just a lot of, let's call them yogic practices, right? That, exercise and a cold shower and things that help you expand beyond the contractive sense of your physiological identity. Those are all kinds of things that are very practical in terms of self-overcoming and generating energy. And Nietzsche had a kind of health regime because his health was bad. So he was I think he talked about, doing 10 little self-overcomings per day. And a lot of those were physical, just trying to build up some energy in yourself. As for the question of radically listening and accepting, that's an ongoing life challenge. I think to be able to take the perspective of the other and to sort of psychologically steel man it, like try to say what's valid about what other people are saying, trying to give space to risk the sense of the abyss that happens when you're just inwardly quiet and allow the other person to say whatever they're going to say, even if it sounds like nonsense to you. And also genuine curiosity. You have to find things in what the other person is saying that you're actually interested in that might pertain to your values some way. Otherwise, your listening is pretty stale.
Anything you want to add to that, Thomas?
This sounds a lot like releasement, which is my whole PhD research on the concept of releasement in Heidegger. But on the conclusion, it talks about how releasement relates to Nietzsche's eternal reoccurrence of the same. So, like, in a way, there's nothing to do. Because, like, and I think this comes back to, like, what for me was quite an important phase in my life with Alan Watts. Like, so when he takes you through meditation and the cultivating and the practice is there for you to listen, but to realize that you're not listening voluntarily, you are always listening anyway. And it's at that moment that you kind of do the practice, but not just to achieve the next step. You do the practice to realize that you are always already listening. And that's the joy. That's when it's like, oh God, like I've been listening the whole time. And of course, it's maybe a bit different with accepting. But I would come back to Nietzsche and say, well, Nietzsche is saying that what we should accept or need to accept or ought to accept was always an illusion. but then we can go and accept it anyway, but whilst being aware that that illusion either affirms life or negates life. And that's, again, a joy. That's an art.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, why, like, okay, I live in a society, so there are certain responsibilities I have towards others. They're all illusionary, but I'm going to affirm those illusions and those ideas and those other people around me in a certain way where I can maximize what you've just said, like an open space where they can be what they need to be for me and I can be what I need to be for them. So there's a willing, but the willing is always to kind of open up. And
yeah, that shift in the value of self-deception is really huge here, because I can be present, understanding that I'm under delusion, but also I can accept that you're under delusion and that that's not an invalidation of what you're saying. If I'm talking to someone and they've got some nonsense that they believe about the world, from Nietzsche's point of view, that's okay. That's not the alternative to being some sober person who knows what reality really is. If everybody's inhabiting some kind of necessary structure of illusion, then when you get triggered by someone else's illusion, you don't have to identify with that. You know, of course, you're just identifying the fact that they are deluded, as you are, as we all are. And so that's a necessary precondition for being with someone. So you can relax a lot of the social polarization responses just by saying it's okay for people to be illusionary in their response to the world.
I think this is one very quick comment. I think that what's interesting to introduce here is the question of, like, for example, violence. So Vattimo talks about charity, but he talks about, like, he has this idea of hermeneutic communism as pure illusion. But for him personally, communism is a hermeneutic communism, meaning where you're aware that it's an illusion. For him, that's just the way today that we can minimize violence, which arises through other illusions. So like the hegemonic illusion that we have today, the system that we live in, communism for him is the other illusion, which gives a reduction of violence towards being within that framework. So fine, he was liberal for a long time. Everybody can enjoy your illusion, enjoy yourself. I can enjoy my illusions, but those illusions have an effect on the way that we participate in the world. So it's not to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's just to say, well, we should look how that minimizes things like violence, which has kind of like a bodily effect, you know?
Yeah.
And that for me is always quite interesting, because I think Zizek does something similar with materialism. So he goes back to what's material as a result of illusions, because it has an effect upon our place within society, which is an illusion, but it has an effect. So
I think that's related to the curiosity issue. Like, one of the things I see Nietzsche doing a lot of is really being interested in people, and not interested in what they're saying about themselves, but in the consequences of what it would mean to have that opinion, or in what the underlying energies and power dynamics are trying to do. There's a beautiful passage where he speaks about the people who are the born diviners of souls, and how good it is for those people to run into a cynic or somebody like that, because it sort of abbreviates the amount of time you have to spend figuring out how other people are thinking. But it suggests that he's listening through people for something. He's listening to what the impacts would be, where the energies are moving, what the structures are. But fundamentally, he's listening for what's interesting to him. He's not just listening to a social reaction to the surface type of content another person is saying. He wants them to tell him something about what he's interested in about the world. And I think that makes us much better listeners.
So Nietzsche himself was a listener and an acceptor. So he maybe is the highest Overman, you know, to go back to the question before.
That's a nice connection. Max also asks, what does it mean for Nietzsche? What does it mean for Nietzsche to say someone is a worthy philosopher or a good philosopher? Well, I can say that in my research that the philosophers he really did affirm were, at least as far as I can tell, is Zoroaster, Spinoza, Schopenhauer, although he eventually goes against Schopenhauer, and Emerson. What do they all have in common? I do think they all have a certain relationship with nature, and a certain willingness to connect metaphysics to the natural world in some sense. I'm not sure if that's how Nietzsche would say is a specific definition for a good or a worthy philosopher, but it's certainly a type of philosopher that Nietzsche gravitated towards. Do you guys have a view on this?
I think I think more towards the end, he affirms those philosophers for him personally, that even if he sees them as having certain illusions, for him personally, they were philosophers which set him on the path towards where he found himself. So like he becomes like cynical against Schopenhauer's pessimism, but as he's thinking affirms everything in the end, he thanks Schopenhauer for bringing him on that path. So like in that sense, like the whole history of human beings has been is worthy of affirmation for Nietzsche, because it meant that he is where he is because he was fated to be there. But I think in his earlier work, he enjoys those thinkers which, like you said, bring us back to nature, but then also bring us back to where we can't then read like nature as something pessimistic like Schopenhauer did. You know, it's like this pure will that is just incessant, that's just driving towards without anything, like any like pure negativity in a very negative nihilistic sense. Because I think for Nietzsche, and this again is my postmodern reading, Schopenhauer makes a metaphysics out of nature and assumes that it's pessimistic, and that becomes quite dogmatic for Nietzsche, because it's not about just saying, well, nothingness is just pure horror and terror, and that's how things really are, because in doing that, you're attributing value to nothingness. You're determining its basic characteristic, and you're just reacting to that, you know? I think Nietzsche passes through nothingness because he wants to show us how even nothingness is ready to be negated and to be, or nihilism, how nihilism itself is ready to be overcome. So I think Schopenhauer is an interesting connection. But what you, like we said this before we came on, went live, it was interesting to hear the Alexander Bard's review earlier talking about, or yesterday or earlier, talking about Spinoza, because I never really came across much literature on this, and it was interesting to see related to monism.
Yep.
That was very nice.
Yeah, Nietzsche makes some little mentions, like he has a few positive mentions of Spinoza, but he doesn't spend a lot of time going into that stuff. Obviously, his relationship to Schopenhauer is fascinating, where he seems to disagree with almost all of Schopenhauer's conclusions, but he loves the areas Schopenhauer was looking, and I think he loves the personal style that Schopenhauer brings to it. Right? Schopenhauer, in a way, is a bit of an antagonist to Hegel. And instead of the systemic approach, Nietzsche really honors a philosopher who's going to put a lot of personal stylistic character and juiciness into the things they're saying, even to the point of being hyperbolic about all sorts of elements of society. He's critical of what he calls the underlaborers and the baggage handlers of philosophy. And a lot of people who work at a university philosophy departments would fall into that category. He wouldn't consider them to be real philosophers. So they're not bad philosophers, but they're not really doing the job of a philosopher. They're helping out by analyzing this or that area. He's interested in commanding philosophers, people who can make a big synthetic vision as a kind of individual power move. He's interested in philosophers who discover or create new values that might be useful to the tribes of the future. And of course, he's very interested through Zarathustra in a new class of attempter philosophers who he sees coming up over the horizon, people who are going to take risks with thought. And maybe some of the postmodernists were examples of that. Like there's ways in which Foucault is very Nietzschean and ways in which he's not very Nietzschean, but he's taking a lot of risks with the normal way we relate to knowledge, as are many of the great 20th century thinkers. So I think he's looking for people willing to be daring, to be experimental as a good philosopher. I think at some point he says it's not about how much truth you know, it's about how much truth you can dare. So if people are willing to take that emotional risk to go beyond the things that structure the way they relate to knowledge itself.
I think even Kant was big in his earlier life for this reason, because with Kant's turn, he radically changed the way we view our own subjectivity. So even if he doesn't make much reference to him as his work progresses, there's a few years in his earlier years where he really says like Kant did something to the history of Western philosophy for exactly those reasons, you know, for questioning the basic conditions which enable us to think things.
Yeah.
And even if the conclusion, like same with Schopenhauer, wasn't correct, it was still provocative in the way that it shaped A, his thinking, and B, the history towards European nihilism, you know?
All right, I think I'm going to ask. Maybe we have time for 2 more questions. The first one, I'm going to just it's straight for you, Layman, which says, Layman, what do you think of the Bronze Age pervert?
The Bronze Age pervert.
Do you have an opinion on the Bronze Age pervert?
I take it as somebody's name, or is it just?
Yeah,
book, I think.
Okay.
It's a specific reference to something that I'm not aware of it, but I could think in general about what a pervert might be like in the Bronze Age.
Okay, no, I think it's a reference to a particular book or a particular thinker. So if you're not aware of it, then we'll move on to another question. Okay. Last question for both of you. What is Max Macken asks, what is the relationship between the prophet and the philosopher in Nietzsche's work?
Prophet, yeah, I can think of a few references, but it just makes me think of what Heidegger wrote about how Nietzsche's Zarathustra was an advocate. And I know it's a bit different from a prophet, because a prophet's somebody who can foresee the actual conditions of the future. But I think an advocate in Nietzsche is really, really vital, because what he's doing is advocating nihilism to the point where nihilism is overcome. So I don't know if he's actually like prophesizing what will happen. I know he prophesized about the 100-year history. But I think this comes back to the task of the philosopher. Like, what is the philosopher there to do? And it goes back to the question of, what does it mean for Nietzsche to be a worthy philosopher? It goes back to what Layman just said, like to a philosopher who's been brave enough to question the framework in which they found themselves, to expose themselves to criticism, to expose themselves to the herd mentality, yeah, and maybe that question's changed today, because we're at in my opinion, and of course it could get worse, we're in a form of nihilism which has become radically, explosive. Like what is the task of a philosopher today in Nietzsche's work? I think it would have changed based upon our today's conditions. So postmodern philosophy really makes emphasis on the fact that relativity, meaning like how everything is just relative, that's gone to its extreme today. And also contingency, meaning everybody's kind of aware of the fact that everything we say is based upon history, not upon some kind of divine intervention. So maybe, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously they're closely related in Nietzsche to some degree, and he does both functions in various moments. Like he has some really surprisingly good anticipations of what the 20th century is going to bring, and he also has that capacity the prophets have to challenge the existing civilization and say, almost facetiously would say they haven't gotten right with the Lord, so to speak. We're off track. Things are going in the wrong way. The way we're handling things is going to decrease the amount of meaningfulness and power and vitality and health. And so the prophet says we have to get back on track. We have to, the will to power channels have become all knotted up here, and we've got to get them flowing again. And both of those, the prophet and the philosopher, serve a function for this Dionysian spirit, which, to answer the previous question again, that's one of the ways he would judge a philosopher today, I think, is are they articulating the Dionysian movement? And the Dionysian movement is articulated on the one hand by explainers, and on the other hand by people who are directly calling out existing social structures and saying, look, if we keep doing it like this, we're going to face disaster. We've got to do it differently, and that's the prophetic challenge.
All right, guys. Thanks for joining me for this 2 hours. It was, I think we had a constant flow of questions there. And it's just great.
Good questions.
Great questions. And a good excuse to spend a couple more hours with you guys talking about Nietzsche. So for everyone still watching or listening, this has been an Ask Us Anything, and it's in preparation for a course on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which will be which I'll be leading throughout the entire summer. It'll extend into September. It's a 9-week course. There will be 6 classes as well as a one-on-one option if you want to work one-on-one with me to relate the different sections of Thus Spoke Zarathustra to your own life, whether personally or professionally. You can find out more about the course at philosophyportal.online. And the landing page for Thus Spoke Zarathustra actually functions already as kind of like an open access preparatory course. There's 4 videos there that explain in the main concepts of each of the sections of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and all of the Nietzsche Dialogues are already on the landing page, together with a few Substack articles I've written about core Nietzschean concepts, about the logic of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and as well as post-Nietzschean interpretation. So this is all to say that there is a lot of material on the landing page which can be helpful for you to study as you go through the course, or just to use at your own leisure if you're so inclined. All right. So with that being said, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Layman, for joining me again. And do you have any final words for the viewers?
Enjoy where you are. Enjoy the course, because they're already going to do the course. Enjoy. Yeah. No. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, this has been great. I strongly endorse the course. I think what Cadell is doing is the leading edge of Nietzsche studies in the world at the moment. Very nice to get to know Thomas a little bit. And if you want my book on Nietzsche, reach out to me with some financing.
That's a good place to end. Someone get Layman a bag. We gotta get Layman the bag there.